You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you for another week. We're back from Big 12 Media Days. If you're watching on video, you can see my hat that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But, you know, Big 12 Media Days are interesting. They're interesting. We'll get into that. How about we get into that? So today we will talk about the Big 12 Media Days, what took place, how Utah fared, kind of the conversations, the takeaways from that. And then today we will continue that scheduling series that we've been doing all summer with Utah's next opponent, which will be TCU. So this will be Utah's 11th game. We're getting right to the end of this for the schedule, and we're about close to actual fall camp. So we're getting there. The unofficial start was last week with Big 12 Media Days, but we still got a bit. We're still a little ways out, so we'll get into that. But first, let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union before we get into this stuff. Utah fans, here's a little bit of local history. Canyon View Credit Union got its start on the University of Utah campus back in 1956, and nearly 70 years later, they're still committed to helping students succeed. That's why Canyon View CU awards $15,000 in scholarships each fall and spring specifically for University of Utah students. Because college isn't just about earning a degree, it's about creating opportunities, chasing goals, and building a future. Supporting a student has been part of Canyon View Credit Union's story since day one. Their roots run deep here, and they're proud to continue giving back to the campus community where it all started. To learn more about Canyon View Credit Union's scholarship opportunities, visit canyonviewcu.com. Canyon View Credit Union, shaping your financial journey. All right, let's jump into this. Let's jump into the Big 12 Media Days. And to do that, first, let me tell us about our overlords. Drink Monster Energy. Yeah, we're going to put this on loop. You should just drink Monster Energy. I think there's some subliminal messaging there. Drink Monster Energy. I don't know. I was told I have to say that. No, nobody told me I had to say that. Monster Energy obviously became a big talking point at Big 12 Media Days. Look, I got free Monster, and I'm not going to turn away from that. I do like my Monster Energy, so you know it is what it is. But you know, interesting conversations around that, and solely because Brett Yormark gets up there and announces that the Big 12 has signed a naming rights deal with Monster Energy. They'd already had a previous sponsorship with them. They were the official drink of the Big 12. But now the Big 12 and the Monster Energy have taken a full dip in the pond together, essentially, right? The two of them are interconnected, and Monster Energy now has the naming rights for football and men's and women's basketball. So basically, every event that is done by the Big 12 will now say Monster Energy's Big 12, whatever. That's how the media day was. It was Big 12, well, Monster Energy Big 12 Media Days. What that means is now you're going to see a logo, the Big 12 logo, that is going to have some sort of monster detailing. And my understanding is the green logo has to stay. So this is going to be a co-branded logo. I don't know if that's going to mean the Big 12 logo is green and it has kind of the look right here as the monster logo, or if it'll just be the co-branded where the Big 12 will be the standard white logo or whatever color they decide on, and then you have the Monster Energy logo right underneath it. I don't know. Either way, that patch is now going to go on all jerseys, as is normal. The Big 12, see, it's already subliminally in there. The Big 12, I almost said it again. The Big 12 already has a patch on every single jersey for, football, men's and women's basketball, right? This will now enhance that, quote unquote, by adding the monster logo to that. So as that stands, every university or every school is going to have to put that patch on their uniform. That's just a standard thing. That's part of the logoing of the Big 12. So if you think the Big 12, it's now that plus Monster Energy. Those two are interconnected. As part of that, that is also going to be the logo that is going to be on the fields, that's going to be on the courts. That is what you're going to see all the time. So it's Big 12, it's Monster Energy, both of those are connected. Now, as part of that, there's all sorts of other branding and other things that are going to take place with this. But as it relates to that, the universities are expected to receive about $1 million every single year as part of this deal. So, as Mark Harlan put it, that's $1 million more than the university got. So, like, as much as people want to, poo-poo the deal, it's still an extra $1 million. Now, the reality of this comes down to how much the Big 12 took. So you're basically naming your conference Monster Energy Big 12. You've put everything on the courts, the fields, on the jerseys, and all you're getting is $1 million for each team. That felt very low, right? It felt like if you're going to do something like that, a naming rights partnership, there should be more money there. The same day that they did this, UNLV announced that they were going to get 2.2 million per year for their jersey sponsorships, jersey patch, right? Now, with that said, these Monster Energy slash Big 12, those don't preclude other universities from securing their own patch deals. This has now become legal in the NCAA. You can now have sponsorship deals to put a patch on your jersey. So you've got that. Other universities are going to be adding something to that. BYU recently announced that they have a partnership with a local company that's going to be on theirs, right? Utah is in the works with doing that. They're a little bit more delayed because of their Crimson brand partnerships that they've just created through the PE deal. And so there's been a lot of hiring going on to be able to make that work, though there have been many conversations about what there have been. And I've heard a few of the partners that they were considering or at least looking into. That doesn't mean that they were even down that road. There should be a good partner there, but we'll see. The details have to be worked out. I don't know that we're going to ever hear the monetary dollars unless either Utah or the entity decide to release what they're giving. But that's kind of the new era of what this is going to be. So that was part of Brett Yormark's comments. Just the Big 12 has basically been bought by Monster. That's basically how it sounds. It felt like it was really low value. Granted, this is a conference wide thing. They're not going to have as much brand. I don't want to say they don't have as much brand recognition at, let's say, a regular team, but it's harder to kind of get the value there. So, the fact that you do get extra money is great, but at the same time, it did feel low. I'm not going to pretend like I know all the details here of everything, but at the same time, it felt like a low deal, and the Big 12 could have gotten a better opportunity. Now, with that, there's NIL opportunities. I'm sure there's sponsorship opportunities there. So, it is what it is. A lot of the players out there were drinking Monster Energy. How this relates to some schools with, for example, Utah, which is a Pepsi owned school or a Pepsi sponsored school. Coke owns a share of Monster Energy, and so there may be some friction there. There's going to be friction with maybe some other energy drinks. If Utah had wanted to go with another energy drink partner as a sponsor, that can't be done now because Monster Energy is the sole energy drink of the conference. And so, those types of deals will be worked out. Because this is a Big 12 sponsorship, this isn't something that will damage, so to speak. Let's say Utah's Pepsi deal, that deal is about to end here soon. They could re-up or they could switch to Coke. They could do whatever. There's a lot of different things there. So that's a little too much talk about Monster, but you got to do it. Here, let's do it one more time on the video. Got to drink Monster Energy. Got to get that subliminal messaging. Want to make sure I'm getting paid. I'm not getting paid $1 for this. So you're welcome, Monster, for getting free advertisement. This has been a great deal already for Monster. They're getting a ton of advertisement out of this. And so, win for Monster Energy. Should we say that again? How much subliminal messaging can I give you? All right. Beyond that, Brett Yormark had his standard conversations. There was a lot of talk about really nothing. I'll say that this was probably the year where the least amount of information came out of that. Obviously, there's talk about trying to be positioning the Big 12 in a way that allows it to be able to be competitive in the rest of the conferences. There was a lot of talk about the Big 12 going global and how its global reach is helping. It's one of the most global conferences in the world, right? Whatever you want to believe with that, it's really just trying to position themselves to be able to say, hey, we're trying to expand, we're trying to grow. Maybe not expand is the right word, but trying to grow the reach of the Big 12. Now, The problem there is can they? I don't know. That's a really tough ask, especially in this era where you do have the Big Ten and the SEC that take up the largest market share of college sports. So, interesting nonetheless. There was obviously conversations, very little about Texas Tech. Brett Yormark shut that down pretty heavily. Even the Texas Tech shock jock reporter being in quotation marks there, who went famous, so to speak, viral for his bizarre question that really didn't make sense, that had some value to it, but didn't really get there. And Brett Yormark shut him down pretty hard. Now, I'm not going to get into that too much. That's what media days is. People ask random questions. You don't have to answer them. The merits of some of the questions that were there were valid. It was just a very poorly executed question. You know, it is what it is. I mean, you could, it is. Yeah, whatever. There was talk about the 2014 playoffs. Is this what the Big 12 is interested in? As you'll remember, the 16-team playoffs is what the Big 12 wanted previously. They wanted to be able to have access to it. Brett Yormark said that now that they've had conversations and have looked into it more, they feel like the 2014 playoff is the best fit for them. More of that is just getting more access for teams. They feel like they would have more access to a lot of these teams. Mark Harlan talks to us after about that. He's on the selection committee for the college football playoffs. He felt like it was tough to be able to only have one team in from the Big 12. There should be more access. So I think there's a unified effort around, the coaches, the athletic directors, the commissioner, about the Big 12 wanting to be in part of the 2014 playoff. Now, how that looks, how that shapes up remains to be seen. There's a lot of conversations that have to be had about that, but that's that. So that's enough about Brett Yormark. I'm sorry I've already bored you enough with that. You can go get your Monster Energy drink now and be great. So if I had my Monster Energy right here, that'd probably be a better fit. I should have had my can. It's okay. Moving on to Utah, because that's what you really care about. At the end of the day, there's nothing earth-shattering here, right? Big 12 media days, you come into these things and everybody is undefeated. Everybody's happy about the offseason work that they've done. Everybody's gotten better. Everybody's done all the things that they need to improve. Everybody thinks that they are able to win a Big 12 title. The reality, there's a lot of nuance there. Utah was no different. The difference is here, though, with Morgan Scalley, this being his first time, he did not look like this was his first time. He looked very well poised. He was, looked like somebody that has been preparing for this moment for a long time. He was charismatic. He was fun. He was energetic. He gave insightful answers without giving too much, right? He doesn't shy away from culture being the thing that binds this team together. And culture is such a buzzword that everybody uses in sports, where it's just the word that you have to say to be able to say that we're trying to build something, but in reality not a lot of programs do build a culture. Morgan is very intent on trying to build a culture. He's trying to make this bigger than one individual, right? And fortunately for Utah, they recruit to a lot of that, where they try to get people, especially in Morgan's realm, where he's trying to build this connective tissue, this connective fiber that goes through the entirety of the program, where you're not trying to get prima donnas and you're not trying to just get the star talent just to get the star talent. You can chase that a lot of times, and that becomes a dangerous thing at times, to be able to try to chase the stars, so to speak. And Morgan is trying to create a collective effort with this team where they all buy in together. And as we've seen so far in spring, and I've talked about this many times on here, there has been a great effort to do that, right? We'll see if this all means anything at the end of the year, right? Like, does Morgan have what it takes to be able to be a head coach? I think he does, but at the same time, that's not proven until you see the results on the field, right? They have the talent. That's certainly there, right? And he talked specifically about Devin Dampier and the fact that he was injured, and how much that limited him despite the successes that he had last year. He's excited to see him take it to that next level. He's seen a lot of leadership from him, even more so than he has before, and what he can do this year. Devin is looking a little bit slimmer. He looks more physically ready. He seems more dialed in this year. Not that he wasn't before, but he's still the fun loving guy that's laughing, having fun, but he's very focused on this year. But as part of that, it's this whole connective tissue that I was talking about, where he's trying to bring everybody together. Devin Dampier, paid for his receivers to go down to Arizona and train with him. He's bringing in a lot of different guys. He obviously takes care of his offensive linemen. There's a lot of things that he tries to do to build that team chemistry. And it's not just him. You've got other guys. You got Wayshawn Parker that was there. You got Lance Holtzclaw, Jonathan Hall. All of those guys were great representatives for Utah at the Big 12 Media Days because these are the leaders of the team. These are the guys that everybody's looking to. And they're not just leaders because they're the ones that produce more on the field. They're the leaders because they're doing that as well as showcasing it off the field, where they're getting guys in to work. They're pushing people. They're trying to get them so that they can be a Big 12 title contending team. Like I said, we don't know if any of this will come to fruition, right? It's tough. Things can happen, injuries can happen. There's other things that take place with other teams that may be better, right? But you're seeing with this team a ton of chemistry, and we'll really see how that's tested when they have their first adversity of the season. Maybe it's week 1, maybe it's week 2, maybe it's week 6, right? But I think that's where you're going to see the test come the most. I think one stressing thing from Devin Dampier the most is that, beyond the injuries, and I wrote an article about this yesterday. You can go check it out on KSL.com about kind of what Devin said about his injuries and how he felt limited and how humbling it was last year to be able to not feel like he can be ready. I mean, there's several games, especially late in the season, where he was not feeling like he could even play, and yet he still did. So, he's beyond that. There's a renewed focus for him to be able to showcase his ability, right? To be able to showcase what he can do, to be able to have this mindset that he can take it to that next level. And it's not one of those things too where he's here by default, right? It's not like Jason Beck left him at Utah and he didn't have a landing destination. He, maybe there was a desire to go to Michigan, but at the same time, he felt fully bought into Morgan Scalley. Morgan Scalley came to him early, made him the central focus of kind of his recruiting efforts. Even though he'd already kind of had those conversations before, there was a huge emphasis, and the two, Morgan Scalley and Devin Dampier, are hugely connected. They have a great, connection there. Devin Dampier feels very connected to this Utah team, to the coaches. There's a lot more connective tissue there than there was in previous years. And none of that to say that Kyle Whittingham did anything wrong or that he didn't do it the right way. But there's so much more of that connection between the players and the coaches than there ever has been. Morgan wants to be able to get these people, these players, to feel like people. I said that backwards, but he wants them to feel like people, right? Not just another person on the roster. He wants them all to feel connected. And there's things that you have to do, and you have to be committed, and you have to work hard, and you have to do all these things. The RSNB stuff that fits entirely with this team. But at the same time, there's a lot more of that connection there where it's not just head coach, quarterback, or head coach, running back, wherever it may be. Everybody is connected. There's, pushes to be able to say, you're not going to just stick with the quarterbacks. You're going to work in with defensive linemen, and you're going to do this. So there's a lot more blending of the team instead of just offense, defense, special teams. There's a lot of connections there. And so that was shown at Big 12 Media Days and through some other experiences that I'm still working on that I promise you it's going to come, that I'll share later. But there is a lot of connection that Morgan Scalley is trying to do, and all of that was present there. I could go through a lot of the things that these guys talked about. At the end of the day, this was a good media day for Utah. There wasn't anything bad. There wasn't anything negative. Utah was also one of the last teams to go, and so there was a little less fanfare around them. But there is a belief that this Utah team can be near the top, right? Where they shake out, whether they're 1, whether they're 6, whether they're 2, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to, how they perform on the field. And I think there's going to still be some doubters because of Morgan Scalley in his first year. There's going to be some doubters of Devin Dampier with some of the things that were seen last year and the frustrations of how he was throwing. Once you knew he had a sports hernia and all that, that showcased a lot of like where some of his limitations were. I'm curious to see how those progress this next year. There was a lot of talk about Utah moving forward with arguably its best wide receiver unit that they have. All of those things are great, and it still could not be enough. There could still be a situation where the offensive line doesn't work and it doesn't gel. There's a lot of conversation about it doing that, And there's a lot of conversation about this offense being able to be very dynamic in what it does, where if one thing is taken away, they can shift to something else pretty quickly. But once again, we have to see it on the field. But I think there was a lot of positivity there, as there always is at Big 12 Media Days. But I think, this year it was a different vibe. I'll say that. Like that's the best way that I can put it. They were having fun, they were serious, but they also felt like they were a little bit of the underdogs, where coming into this, they've got a lot to prove and that they can come out there and be one of the top teams in the conference. So, really fascinated to see how it all goes. I'll try to sprinkle in a little bit more of these Big 12 media takeaways as we go. I'll have some more articles written. I think, there's a lot of interesting storylines to come from that. I obviously started with the Devin Dampier one this week. I want to get into a Wayshawn Parker, Lance Holtzclaw. I mean, one side note with Wayshawn, he's taking it upon himself to be a completely different player this year. He saw that he needed to do more last year. He's taken it more serious. I've talked about in spring how he's been much more dialed in. He's taking care of his body really well. He's more mature in what he does. There's a different mindset to him. And one of the things that showed his maturity the most to me is in the conversations that he had with us. He said his biggest priority is protecting Devin Dampier. There could be a lot of things that he could shoot for in that moment. And if you asked him, like, what do you want to do? One of the first things that he talked about was protecting Devin Dampier. That to me shows that maturity, where it's not chasing his own stats. No, don't get me wrong. He wants 1,000 yards. That drove him crazy that he just barely missed 1,000 yards last year. This year, he's going to be very well intent on getting that, right? He's going to be more of a receiver as well. There's going to be a lot of elements there where he's going to be able to receive and do different things that way. But there's going to be a big push from him specifically to be able to get to that next level. But the fact that that is such a driving focus for him, and he still believes that his number one goal is to protect Devin Dampier, shows the maturity that he's taking upon himself, where it's not just about himself. It is this collective unit, this collective team where he has to, if Devin Dampier can be effective, he too can be effective. And so I think that alone showed kind of the maturity and the expectations that he has for himself, but for this team, that kind of showcase how this Utah team is. So that's once again some more takeaways. We'll get into some of these. I'll try to share some audios. I'll try to share some of these things as we go, as we ramp up to fall camp, which will begin the first week of August. So we'll start getting reports that week from fall camp and start seeing all that. That first week is obviously going to be much more limited. They can't wear shoulder pads. They have to have an acclimatization. I said that wrong. Acclimatization. Hey, whatever. They have to acclimate. There we go. I don't know why adding a Z in there makes it tough, but acclimate to pads and all that. That's an NCAA rule. So we get into that. All right, let's jump into the TCU Horned Frogs. Before I do that, let me show this one again as a reminder. I do this every time as we jump into a new team. I show the Big 12 odds. This is courtesy of Bovada. This was the preseason odds, that came out months ago. So not much has changed here. As we've talked about, Texas Tech, 10.5 wins. BYU and Utah at 8.5 is the next tier. So there's a lot of these teams that we've talked about that are included in that. For example, Texas Tech is not on Utah's schedule, but you do have BYU, which is, expected to be near the top. Arizona, which is the game that we talked about the week before, they're in that next tier at 7.5. So is Houston at 7.5. Kansas State's in there at 7.5. TCU falls in that next tier at 6.5. They're tied with Arizona State and Baylor in that realm of teams kind of middling, potentially being near the top of the conference. And I think there's a lot of good that can come from TCU. They end the season last year in the top 25. A lot of good from this team that can take place. So, it should be another quality opponent that Utah has to face this year. That back half of the schedule is going to be really tough. You got the BYU, you've got the Arizona, you've got Houston, you've got TCU. It's not going to be an easy slate in that back half of the schedule. So not too easy. So TCU, this will be Utah's only back-to-back games on the road this year. They go to Arizona the week prior, and then they go to Texas Christian for the back half of the back-to-backs. And so, depending on how things go, obviously you get the BYU, you get Arizona, you get TCU. This could be a really tough stretch for Utah to be able to try to compete and to be able to have consistency in what they're trying to do. And if things aren't going well, these road games especially could be very dangerous for Utah as they try to stabilize themselves or try to compete for a Big 12 title. So, you know, maybe these two teams are vying for a Big 12 title and this becomes a deciding game. I think there's several deciding type games along the way that if Utah loses the wrong one, then it could be a world of hurt. So, really, really interesting situation here. This is the first time coming back to TCU in quite a minute, right? The last time these two teams played before 2024 was in 2010, and that was at Rice-Eccles Stadium. We won't talk about that one, but it's been a while since Utah's traveled there. So last year, TCU, as I mentioned, they finished 9-4, 5-4 in Big 12 play, finished in the top 25 in the AP top 25. Really solid season all around. It just wasn't quite to the next level, right? They were in the mix of kind of that next tier of being in the Big 12 title. I mean, Utah was still in there as well. Utah had a little bit more of a leg up on them, but it just wasn't. It just didn't translate fully to where they needed to be. TCU comes into this game after a home game against Kansas State. We'll see what Kansas State is, see if they're improved from last year, what that is. That could be a tough game. They finished the season at Texas Tech. So this is a tough stretch for TCU as well, where it's not going to be easy. But that's where it should be at the end of the season. There should be some of those tougher games at the end of the season. You should be able to have, that ramp up. And so, depending on how Utah does against TCU or how TCU does against Utah, that could be very pivotal for the last week. Maybe Texas Tech is, needing to win to get into the title game, or maybe TCU is needing to win. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. As I mentioned, Utah coming into this game is on the road against Arizona, so those back-to-back games that you have there. So, last meeting between these two teams was a barn burner. TCU win of 13-7 at Rice-Eccles Stadium. Not a great situation. That 2024 season, we're just kind of ridding a lot of those games there. But it was one of those games that Utah could have won. They just didn't have enough offense like they did for most of the season and just couldn't get it done. But the defense held them to 13 points. That's a game that left many Utah fans very frustrated. The fact that you couldn't score 14 points, right? It is what it is, but this should be quote unquote a different situation for Utah. They should be closer to what they were last year with their offensive production, or at least that's the expectations. And you would hope that there's not another 13-7 type game out there, unless both of these teams are just so phenomenal on defense that it becomes tough to score. But I don't think that's going to be the case. I think both of these teams are going to be pretty heavily geared towards the offensive side of the ball and trying to score as many points as possible. And so I think this could be a fun and entertaining game in Fort Worth. So you got that. So last season with TCU, the offense was pretty good, right? Like there was a lot of good that came from the offense. The biggest difference there, though, is they were plagued by turnovers. They had 20 total turnovers for the season, and 15 of those came off of interceptions. Not a great situation. The defense didn't help at times, but it wasn't fully the conversation, right? It was mostly the turnovers that absolutely put TCU in a bad spot. Many of those games flipped in wrong ways. TCU was on the losing end in a very bad way against BYU. That game was expected to be a little bit more competitive. I think BYU was expected to still win, but it was expected to be competitive. TCU had some games where, they did really well and they had leads or whatever might have you, and then just would throw a pick or they'd turn the ball over and it didn't work out for him. So really that was the story of last year, was the turnovers. Not a great situation. The offensive coordinator, Kendall Briles, moves on to South Carolina. I don't know that Sonny Dykes would have changed him. I think they still liked what they had, air raid type offense. But Kendall Briles moves on and goes to South Carolina, and it's a new regime change essentially. And Sonny Dykes brings in a new offensive coordinator in Gordon Sammis. Now, Sammis, he was an offensive lineman when he played, and so there's going to be a lot of physicality traits to him. He wants to muck it up essentially. He wants to bring a physical type game that wasn't always Sonny Dykes' mantra, right? There was a lot of air raid elements to what Sonny has done. All of his teams usually were heavy passers, or at least a heavier emphasis in passing. So this becomes a far different situation. Gordon Samus comes in from UConn, where at UConn they run a pro style offense, and I'll get into that scheme here shortly. But they were very efficient with it at UConn. Obviously, for the last probably decade, UConn hasn't really registered much on the radar. And last year they kind of turned the corner and everything really changed for them. Their quarterback, who really nobody even heard of him, just kind of flew under the radar. He threw for 3,400, almost 3,500 yards and 28 touchdowns, and only had one interception. They are very this offensive coordinator Samus. He absolutely wants to limit turnovers. This is the Kyle Whittingham like offense, right? Maybe not to that level. There's a little bit more flexibility there, but they try so hard to limit turnovers, and they do that a lot with a lot of quick passes, essentially. So, just a little bit of the success that he had at UConn. They ranked 15th in scoring offense with 35.3 points last year. With, like I said, I don't mean to be mean, but a nobody quarterback, right? Like that's not how I mean it, but it's a quarterback that's not on anybody's radar. It's not a guy that, had a ton of offers, from high level schools. This is a guy that is a good quarterback, but he wasn't the star quarterback that you were expecting, right? So I'm saying that as more of that context, but they finished with in the 15th in scoring offense at 35.3 points, 12th in passing offense with 284 yards, 0.4 yards per game, and they were third in the nation in turnover margin. They allowed only 2 turnovers the entire year, 1 fumble, 1 interception for a plus 15 turnover margin. That's incredible. That doesn't happen that often. You don't usually get that type of margin. And so you can see kind of the intent that he has on protecting the ball and being able to make sure that they limit that as much as possible. And if you can do that at the Big 12, at the Power 4 level, all the more power to you, because that's going to win TCU a ton of games. So Gordon Samus brings in also 2 coaches from UConn. He's trying to build that connection. So he brings in his QB coach and his running back coach to build that kind of consistency and consistency. We'll just say that. So, there is some of that. This is a completely different offensive scheme shift for Sonny Dykes. But he felt like this, he's been watching him for a while and he really likes what he's done. It fits their system. And so the shift was merited in what they wanted to do. But it's a shift, right? Like it's not the Sonny Dykes of last year or even the last few years with Josh Hoover, where they're just tossing the ball around and you've got a ton of passing yards. This is a little bit more balanced, I would say, a little bit more physical. It is a shift from the air raid to a pro style offense. So think what Kyle Whittingham has done the last few years with especially Andy Ludwig, that kind of stuff. They want physicality. They want ball control, the ball controlling the system. There's a lot of wide outside zone. The way that he builds it, essentially all of his offense is schemed around outside zone. So there's going to be a lot of the way that they approach that. There's going to be a lot of 12 personnel. There's going to be a lot of 13 personnel. You're looking at Utah a few years ago in terms of how they're going to put themselves on the field. Now, there's a little difference in kind of the balance and how they work. I think Andy Ludwig's system was just too complex, where this is not expected to be complex. There's a lot more simplicity here. There's a lot more ease to being able to get into that offense. And so there should be an easier time running this pro style offense, but it's going to have very similar concepts to what Utah ran the last few years. You want to be physical, you want to control the ball, RPOs. There's going to be a lot of quick reads. There's going to be a lot of stuff that way, and they're going to try to limit sacks and havoc plays, mostly with those 12 and 13 personnel, right? So getting to the quarterback is going to be incredibly tough. You're just going to have to limit him in a different way and hope that you're on top of things. So that's kind of the offensive philosophy there with TCU. Like I said, it's a difference. It's a shift in mindset for Sonny Dykes. but one that could pay off, right? It very well could pay off if they can get all these pieces to work. And for the most part, this offense and defense is fairly well similar to what they've already had. They've got a lot of holdover from that, and I'll get to that here shortly. They also have their defensive coordinator in Andy Avalos returning. He comes back. It wasn't a great year for the defense, but it wasn't terrible. But Avalos, you may remember, was with Boise State and with Oregon. And not to bring it up, but the 2019 Oregon team is the defense that he had. One of the best defenses there. Really solid team. Obviously hurt Utah in their hopes for a Big 12 or Pac-12 title, excuse me, and a playoff run. So, a lot of success there on the defensive side of the ball. If they can build off of that, this defense becomes much more dangerous. They've added some good pieces that I think can do it, but there's still enough there where it's still a question. So with Avalos, he likes to run what is called a multiple 4-2-5 defense. Multiple just meaning there's multiple looks, right? Like you're able to shift in and out of different things. Most of that is he uses a stud linebacker basically as a decoy. He can either be as a linebacker, he can be lined up as a D end. And there's a lot of mobility there, a lot of hybrid situations there where you're trying to not key in on the offense where you're going, right? If he's lined up as a D end, is he actually, a pass rusher, or is he dropping into coverage, that kind of stuff? And so there's a little bit of stuff there. The secondary also does a lot of different shifts. So they may have their pre-snap look, and then suddenly right before the snap, they shift into something else to try to get you to be confused. And so there's a lot of differences that way that they're trying to make, whether it be simulated pressures or just to get you out of the coverage looks, try to create havoc. They just want to be able to do different things to be able to limit your ability. And for the most part, Andy Avalos has been really successful wherever he's been with that. But we'll see, what he can do with TCU with another year and another play, the same players, many of them coming back, building through that depth and all that. So 4-2-5 base, that's going to be basically what you're at, but it does shift and different things that way. So that's kind of the coaching staff. Looking at the transfer portal, that TCU went pretty light. They were probably more similar to kind of like a BYU, where they had a lot of players that were returning, though many of them were more depth players. There was quite a few players that graduated, left, that kind of stuff. But for the most part, they did a good job of keeping their team together. The biggest name there, obviously, Josh Hoover moves on. Their quarterback, he moves on to Indiana. Now, if you remember, Indiana won the national championship last year. So, what do they see in Josh Hoover? He's a guy that has been incredibly talented with his passing in terms of being able to produce a ton. It hasn't always translated to wins, though. He can put up a ton of yards, but it doesn't always lead to scoring. It can, but it hasn't always been that way. And especially because of his turnover propensity, so to speak. There's been a lot of turnovers from him. And, if you really want to go the full nitty gritty, Sonny Dykes threw some shade at Josh Hoover, saying he was too turnover prone. And good luck to Indiana, because it's not going to work out for you. There was obviously an off-season fight between them and all that, but interesting nonetheless, and kind of entertaining to say the least. But for the most part, you lose your star quarterback who was turnover prone. Maybe he didn't fit the system really well. It didn't sound like he and Sonny Dykes got along, or he was just frustrated because of the transfer. Either way, they're moving on there. Outside of that, most other players that transferred left to a G6 program. Only two other players, Jordan Bailey, a wide receiver, went to Iowa State, and Nate Palmer, running back, went to Wisconsin, but didn't produce really much of anything. So you're not losing a ton to the transfer portal. It was more graduation, that kind of stuff. Incoming transfers, you do get some quality players. You do bring in a quarterback in Jaden Craig from Harvard. Really curious to see how this all blends. Excuse me. But we'll get into him shortly. You bring in an offensive lineman, a wide receiver, a linebacker, a corner, and a free safety who are expected to all be starters. There's some other players that are expected to be in the 2 deep, but for the most part, you're bringing in a fair amount of transfers that can impact the team, but not so much that you're just full of transfers. So let's jump into, the roster pieces, see who's there, see, where this team is going to go. Starting at quarterback, Jaden Craig is going to be the guy. Obviously, you lose Josh Hoover after throwing for almost 3,500 yards and 29 touchdowns, but he had 13 interceptions. That's a lot, and that was the biggest impact on the team in terms of what they were able to do and not do, essentially. Jaden Craig comes in from Harvard, throwing for 2869, threw 25 touchdowns and 7 interceptions at a 61.5% completion percentage. So pretty solid. Only rushed for 78 yards and 3 touchdowns. So there's not a lot of running. I don't want to say there's not a lot of running ability. He just wasn't used as a runner a ton, and I don't know that he will do a lot of that in this offense either. So you're going to have much more of a pocket passer. But because of what they do with that 12, 13 personnel and what they're trying to do with trying to get the ball out quickly, he's going to stay upright for the most part. So Craig is going to be utilized as a dink and dunk merchant. Like, he's going to come in there and do a ton of that, where it's going to be really quick passes. That's not to say they won't take it off the top, but there's going to be a lot more shorter passes, a lot of things to be able to hurt the defense that way. So with Jaden Craig, obviously a smart guy, went to Harvard, but we'll see how that translates to the Big 12 level. I don't really know. I think he's got some pieces around him that can work, but it's going to be a question of if it all can work together. Do you take a step back from Josh Hoover in terms of the total production, but you get a gain with the lack of interceptions? Probably. But maybe, we'll see how it goes. I think they have opportunities to be successful. Obviously, Samus was able to do well at UConn with the different quarterbacks. So I think there's potential there. At running back, you do have your leading rusher come back in Jeremy Payne. He rushed for 623 yards and 5 touchdowns last year. Not a ton, but they also didn't really put a lot of emphasis in the run game. So, you do have a quality back who can do a lot. But yeah, we'll see. Factored into the receiving game a little bit last year as well, had 207 yards. So is capable of doing all that, 800 plus combined all-purpose yards type stuff. So really solid player. He is their focal point, right? He's the guy that's going to be there. The number 2 probably is going to be Landon Walker, a graduate transfer from the Colorado School of Mines. Now, he was only their 3rd leading rusher, so probably not expected to be an every down type back, and you're not expecting that with Jeremy Payne there. But I'm curious to see the depth beyond Payne if they need it. So Walker will be there, but just not a ton of production and doing it at a much lower level. We'll see what happens. At receiver, they do lose their star receiver in Eric McAllister. Sorry about that. Need a drink. This is why we do it live, right? Like, you just get what you get with me. I apologize. They do lose Eric McAllister to graduation. Was expected to go to the NFL draft. Had an injury and some off the field issues that kept him off of a roster. But he finished with 1,100, almost 1,200 yards in receiving last year and 10 touchdowns. So it's a big loss for the team. That was a huge, weapon for Josh Hoover and for this TCU offense. But you bring in other guys that have, not equal, but good production that are going to be right there taking over. And the first one there is likely your wide receiver 1 in Jordan Dyer, redshirt senior, finished with 730 yards last year, 7 touchdowns to be the 2nd leading receiver on the team. So you're not missing anything there. Really solid player that is going to help this TCU team. You bring in a receiver from the transfer portal from South Alabama in Jeremy Scott, had 417 yards last year and 4 touchdowns, was their 2nd leading receiver. Should complement that really well. They should blend really well together and create at least a 1-2 punch in what they're able to do. And then you add to that your slot receiver, who's expected to be Ed Small, sophomore coming into this year, had 186 yards and 2 touchdowns last year in his redshirt freshman year. So freshman year, excuse me. So there's potential and opportunity there. Beyond that, though, there's not a ton of depth with a lot of production. And so, there's going to be a lot of questions as to who can emerge from that. But those are the top 3 that are going to be there. A really solid list, and I think they're going to do really well for TCU. But I think beyond that, if there's injury or other stuff, we just don't know a lot about the players beyond that. So tough to really kind of speculate on what's going to be. They probably have a better plan, but I don't have that. I don't have that. Sorry. Offensive line, for the most part, you have one veteran offensive lineman who's been there a lot. You have three other linemen who have played a consistent amount, one at Oklahoma State and the other enough through their time at TCU that it should blend really well. So you've got your left tackle who's had the most snaps, 895 snaps. Good player. I wouldn't say elite, but a good player that does his job. Your left guard is at 564 snaps. And then after that, it's a little bit lower. You got anything under 400 snaps. So you didn't play a ton of the season, or if you did, you didn't play a lot of reps. You do bring in a right guard from Oklahoma State in Noah McKinney. He's a veteran player. He's a senior. He's the highest graded in pass blocking from Pro Football Focus with an 84. That's probably what you're most excited about. But beyond that, most of these grades for these players are not super high in Pro Football Focus. That doesn't tell a full story, but for the most part, there's still more that needs to be done. And I believe there's going to be a lot more physicality there, especially with your offensive coordinator having been an offensive lineman. There's going to be a big emphasis to make this a physical bunch. And when you add those tight ends in there, you get the 12, 13 personnel. That's going to add a lot to that. So, this is going to be an offensive line that could be formidable. Maybe not the top of the conference, but it could have potential with being able to bring in guys that are familiar with TCU. Granted, the offensive scheme has changed, but really fascinated to see how this blends together, because I think if this offensive line can take just a little bit better or have a little bit better success, I think this offense becomes even more potent. So I think that helps them to be able to have that consistency. I mean, all in all, this offensive side of the ball, there's a lot of consistency there. It's going to come down to the questions of Jaden Craig and how he can be at quarterback and what that means for TCU. But I think there's real potential here for TCU to have a solid offense. It's just going to look different, and not really sure what that's going to be. On the defensive side, the defense is led, I'll say, I'm really struggling today. I'm tired. I'm sorry, guys. I had a son that was sick, and he was keeping me up all night. The defense, there's the major part of the defense that is returning is its defensive line. There's a lot of experience there. There's a lot of production there. And then you have one safety, your strong safety, that is really solid. And I'll get into him in just a second. But for the most part, your four leading defensive linemen, the four defensive linemen, they have a consistency in their approach together. They've got some good numbers there. It's not fully great. This team wasn't great at pass rush last year. And so there's some good stuff done with havoc plays, what have you, but there wasn't a ton of pass rushing success, and not a lot of great opportunities that way. They still had success. Don't get me wrong. I mean, you still combine, let's see, you had, 11 sacks between the four players there. So there's still a lot of success. It just didn't grade out as high as many other teams out there in their pass rushing. So that's something to be desired for this team. At the linebacker position, they bring in a transfer from Virginia Tech and Michael Short. Only played 114 snaps in 4 games with Virginia Tech, so not a ton of under knowledge there. You do get Max Carroll returning. Didn't have a ton of snaps last year either, 219 snaps over 13 games. And so there's a little bit of youth, so to speak, there. They are, redshirt juniors, so they're not young, but at the same time, they just haven't had a ton of production. And so that linebacker group is going to be really fascinating to watch, to see how they can be effective, right? Usually these are the quote unquote generals, the quarterbacks of the defense. And so I'm curious to see how they're able to utilize them, if they can have that communication there that works for them. It's just not been as seen as much, just because they haven't had as many reps. Now, so you've got the front and the back that are pretty solid. In the back, you do bring in corner transfer from Central Michigan and Kalen Carroll, 722 snaps. only allowed 46.8% of passes to him on 62 targets. Really solid player. Had 3 pass breakups, 2 interceptions, 2 touchdowns. Good player that's going to really help that group there. He lines up next to Vernon Glover, who had 52 targets against him and only allowed 52% of passes to him. So pretty solid group right there. Your nickel is going to be great, though he's missed quite a few tackles, almost a third of the tackles that he's expected to get. He missed, and so there's some area of improvement there. But a solid player just needs to kind of gain a little bit more and do well. Your strong safety is probably the star of the defense, in Jamel Johnson. Had 906 snaps last year, 90 tackles, and he only missed 8. Only 8 missed tackles and had 90 tackles. So really solid. He gets to his guy. He gets them down. He had 59 targets against him, and he allowed 66% of those. Now, when you say that, like, yes, there were players that got some passes on him, but he had 2 pass breakups, 5 interceptions, and 7 touchdowns last year. So, really solid player where maybe he doesn't always get the highest grades in Pro Football Focus. For example, his passer rating against him is 100.5, which isn't terrible, but it's not great either. But he's clearly producing by getting 5 interceptions and had 7 turnover or touchdowns. So, there's a lot of production from him. I think he's going to be the star of that team back there at safety. He does a lot to be able to make it challenging, and like I mentioned previously, in those pre-snap reads and how they are able to move and what they do. His free safety next to him is also a veteran guy from Louisiana Tech. He hasn't been as successful in his tackles. He had 29 missed tackles last year, but he also is a ball hawker. He gets 5 pass breakups, or he had 5 pass breakups, 3 interceptions, and 4 touchdowns. And so, that secondary should be pretty solid. Assuming that everybody stays healthy and everything is good, I think the big stars of this defense is going to be up front and obviously in back. The middle is going to be a little bit more questionable, which could make or break the team. But I think there's enough consistency and production from this defensive unit that they should be pretty solid. And I think they could potentially improve from last year, especially if Avalos can kind of get his handle on it and improve it. So really fascinated by this team. I think the biggest question is obviously going to come down to quarterback play, especially with the new quarterback. He is a smart guy, especially as they're going to try to get him the ball out quickly. But what does this offense look like with this new offensive scheme? Can they get it in year one of what they're able to do? Pro style offenses aren't always the easiest to learn in one season, but that also doesn't mean that they can't be. But I think you've got a lot of holdover and consistency on this team that should allow them to be able to be effective in what they do. We'll just have to see. So really curious to see how this all goes for TCU. This is going to be a challenging game for Utah, especially on the road. Depending on how these two teams are at that point in the season, I mean, you're going to know a lot about these teams. Either one of these teams could be limping to the finish. This could be a game between 2 teams that are vying for a Big 12 title. Or it could be 2 middling teams that are just kind of hoping to get the season through after a little bit more expectations were placed on them. So we'll see what happens. Good opponent for Utah, and we'll close this out this week with a preview of West Virginia, which will come into Utah on Black Friday to wrap up the regular season. And then we'll see if that means anything for Utah at the end, if they've got anything more in the tank to be able to get to a Big 12 title. But at least we've previewed a lot of these different teams. If you haven't been able to listen to some of the previous ones, just go back and I've broken them down into various episodes. They're in the title, so you should be able to see. Hopefully what I'm doing here is giving you some information that helps you, that it isn't just a waste of your time and I'm just rambling for nothing. I've tried to do a ton of research into this. There's so much more I could do, but I can't just dump it all on you without absolutely boring you, which I've probably already done. But hopefully this gives you insight onto these teams, and we'll continue to go with previewing Utah and what we're able to do until we get into fall camp and then get into the game. So with that, we're going to sign off. Hope you guys have a great day. Hopefully you're beating the heat out there, or you're on vacation somewhere that's cooler. I just came back from San Francisco, which was 65 degrees. It was really nice. So hope you have a great day, and we will chat with you later.